Okay, so yesterday we started the parsha of Dibur. So Dibur and we're talking about Dibur in the human sense, not Dibur Elyon, not Malchus. That Dibur is a notion of a case. That when we have the Medrash that was trying to explain Brias HaElames, and the notion of initially starting with Midas Hadin and then mixing Midas Harachamim, we brought a mashal which included the mashal of a case. And this is our primary focus for this Maimon and the next. What is the concept of a case? So we briefly talked about Isha, and a female, and a mother as a case. And now we're on to Dibur. So far we said about Dibur that Dibur is dependent entirely on the Seichel and the Midas for both its content and its form, and of its own has nothing. And so it would be surprising, were it to be the case, for Dibur to be able to enhance or improve upon the Seichel or Midas that is forming it, because it seems to not be it just seems to be purely a container, or in a sense not so much a container, more like a conduit. It's like sort of a pathway from the inner nefesh, the emotional and intellectual consciousness being able to be articulated and externalized. And Dibur is just a means towards the end. And to achieve that, there has to be a tremendous amount of tzimtzum, of funneling, of reduction of the original concept or the original feeling. And so once it becomes conveyable in Dibur, it's already far reduced from its original form. Yeah? So it would be very strange that Dibur should have any significant impact on the idea or the feeling. So now we're going to... You can pause. Is there a pause? Just to start. So we're on Daf Hey, Omid Hey rather, at the beginning of the paragraph. When we call mocking, yet nevertheless, notwithstanding all of the what would seem logical with regards to the impact, or rather the non-impact of Dibur on the intellect or the emotions. We see it's not the case. There is indeed an enhancement in the conceptual ideas that become enclosed and expressed in the letters of speech to a greater extent than there was originally when the idea was first expressed in the self, like through machshava. We said that in machshava it should be and it is to a certain degree far more intense of an expression of the idea as it was expressed, and it's further reduced as it comes into Dibur. But nevertheless, when it comes into Dibur, there is an enhancement of the ideas than in comparison to the way it was at its original stage of expression. Shari called Dvar Seichel v'Chochma Sheba min Mekeir HaSeichel B'Medida v'Hagbala. For every single concept and idea and form of intellect that comes from a person's self, they originate. They're able to originate ideas. When it becomes expressed, the mode of expression is always in a contained state. B'shir hemshekh, it's in a defined way to the extent to which it's going to be expressed. Ba'oirech, reichav, v'oimek, in its length, breadth, and depth. And those are three concepts we're going to elaborate. What is the length, breadth, and depth of a concept? In all those three components of a concept, as it develops in the self. As a person, through their consciousness, develops ideas, the ideas are have a measure. They have a degree of restriction to the extent to which they can be lengthy, they can be wide, or they can be deep. And the manner in which the idea is going to be manifest and revealed and expressed is in a very specific way. So before a person even speaks, there are ideas that are generating in the self, and they get expressed. The person is conscious of them through their machshava. So through their machshava, they're able to be aware that they have these ideas developing, and whilst it's there, even before a person's spoken about it, there is a defined concept. The concept is defined. It's not undefined, right? For it to be a concept, it has to have some degree of definition, right? And then that defined and contained idea, once it gets spoken about, once it gets articulated in speech, on the Roin Bechush, we see clearly we find that the concept becomes expanded upon to a far greater extent than it was prior to it being articulated in speech. From all these stages, these prior stages, which we previously were, in the previous paragraph, were assuming there was a far greater degree of expression of the idea. Yet nevertheless, even in its reduced form, in its contained form, in its defined form, as it becomes articulated in speech, all of a sudden it triggers something in the idea that allows it to expand and innovate, self-innovate. The idea becomes much more dynamic. Until it comes into speech, every aspect of the idea was defined and contained in a limited form. For Kandavka, and specifically here, in the articulation of speech, Kashabola Dibur, when it comes to articulating speech, Misrachiv Barchovi Yasera, Beribui Protim, Vistaifus Be'ena Roich Mikmesha Hoya Tchila Ba'isis Machshava. So it becomes expanded and into many, many more details. So the idea originally, as it was contained in the self, before it was able to be externalized through speech, it had very limited and defined ways of it being applied to anything. And now all of a sudden, as I speak, you see connections, you see it becomes possible to be able to relate it to many different details. And it branches out into infinite ways, just through this seemingly innocuous activity of speaking. V'chein, and so too, k'sheba'oir ha'seichel ba'esis ha'dibur, harihu meitze kame inyonim lahalbish bahem oir seichel zeh. So when a person goes from the mode of thinking about an idea to speaking about an idea, they all of a sudden find so many different ways in which to understand and explain and express this idea. Until they're able to draw the idea out and bring it lower and further from its original point, to the extent that it can be communicated to someone of relatively limited intellect. Even were it to have been the case that at the initial stage of development of the idea, the way it was in the self, and it comes into the person's thinking, and even not just the thinking, the way you're thinking to yourself, even when you're thinking how you're going to explain it to somebody else, you weren't able to find, you're thinking, how am I going to explain this to this person who would find it difficult to grasp the idea as I'm understanding it, so I'm going to think about a way how I'm going to explain it to them, and you can't find the method and the mode in which you're going to take this idea and express it in this mashal or that mashal. You haven't got the You haven't found that path of communication whilst you're still thinking to yourself. And it's more than that. It's not just thinking to yourself. It's thinking to yourself about somebody else. So in machshava, there's machshava, which would be thinking about oneself. And there's machshava, thinking about somebody else. So it's already machshava in a very outward-looking state. But even still, it would be very often it will be very difficult to find the words that you're going to use. You're preparing your shir, preparing your speech. You want to be able to articulate. You're writing down your speech, and you just can't find the words. And you don't expect that you're going to be able to communicate this to someone of minimal intellect. You feel in the way the idea is in yourself, the way you grasp it, you could maybe communicate it to somebody who is of similar intellectual stature. But then what happens afterwards? Specifically when you start speaking about the idea, all of a sudden you innovate new formats of how this idea could be packaged and communicated. Which is far more what we call here lamata minyanim hakedim. It's far less abstract and detached from maybe somebody who needs a greater degree of halbasha, a greater degree of enclothing, a greater degree of bringing the idea into an immediacy for them to be able to grasp it. It's through the act of speaking that you somehow find the words. It triggers in the idea itself an expansion that was previously not there. So you can bring to these people of inferior intellect the same ideas that previously you thought you could only teach to an exclusive group of people. And through this, the light of the concept, meaning the sort of like the meaning behind this idea that you're communicating, becomes yoyred. It descends. She says the language. This is the length. And you're able to reveal it to somebody of relatively inferior intellect. So when we said before that an idea has, when it first becomes expressed in the self, will have a restricted degree to which it can be come in its length. What do you mean by its length? Its length is how many layers and levels of explanation it can be expressed in. How far away can it come from the abstraction of the idea to the immediacy of a moshel, of a concrete explanation? So initially in the self, that is limited. But once the person starts speaking, what it does, it expands the capacity of the idea in its oirech, in its length. Yeah? It can extend further. And furthermore, so moreover, through specifically speaking out the idea, will be innovated to you novel aspects of the concept, to the point where it's going to be improved in its depth. And that was, it was nowhere in your mind when you were first thinking the idea. You didn't have all of these profound insights into the concept, but through and this is relying just on the experience of people. People know this when they start articulating and expressing things. The idea starts all of a sudden taking on a new form, and you're able to appreciate deeper notions of the idea that were foreign to you before you spoke about them. When you were thinking about this idea in your mind, in your thoughts, before you'd even spoken about it, you haven't reached anywhere near the level of depth of the idea that you can now appreciate once you've spoken about it and articulated it in speech. It's only through the speech that it gets revealed the very depth of this concept. And therefore, that's why we say when it comes to limud Torah, the halacha is that you're supposed to learn Torah specifically with speech, with dibur. Like it says, you should speak in them, about them. So it's a source of life for those who find them. So the Gemara says, "L'moitzi ehem b'peh davka," and takes the word "l'moitzi ehem" and turns it to "l'moitzi ehem." The ones who express it, articulate them with their mouths. That's when the Torah becomes for you a source of life. The belomde is halacha b'dibur davka, when a person learns a particular halacha with speech and not just thinking it. Then it will be aroused within that person novel and deep novel ideas which will bring you to the depth of that halacha. Which would never have come to the person if they were just studying that halacha in their thought and just reading it with their mind and not expressing it in speech. So the chen lepamim b'dibur davka ba'oira seichel b'kama ifanim shonim. So we've explained oirach, and then we explained oimek. Now we're going to explain reichav, the breadth of the idea. So similarly too, when a person articulates ideas in speech, ba'oira seichel b'kama ifanim shonim, the very same concept can now be seen to apply in many different scenarios and ideas. Which was not the case at the outset when the idea was first expressed in a person internally. Because, as we explained, initially the idea will always have a certain limitation in how, to what extent it can be expressed and revealed. And only afterwards, through having spoken it, the person can now see how this idea has much broader application. Not just in this limited case, you can apply it and understand it in other parallel cases. And then you can combine these two cases, these two circumstances, and realize that they aren't conflicting with each other. Or you can find the common denominator that applies across these cases. Right? Why? Because you see in this concept, the same point of this concept is able to be applied in these multiple cases, would indicate if you have one thing that can lead to two separate outcomes, then those two separate outcomes must be consistent with each other because they originate from the same place. Like we have in the shit of limud of the shita sayu. So you see that by finding the original concept, you can see that when Rabbi Akiva says in Rabbi Shmuel, they say this in different places, that they're all following the same shitta. So that would be the reicha, that would be the breadth of the concept, how it can apply across multiple circumstances. And it's all because of the reason we mentioned above. How does this all happen? That when a person speaks out a concept, they reach to the very depth of the idea. Because then a person is able to grasp the concept in its depth, in a very wholesome way. And that then triggers, because of the oimek, you can reach the reichav, the breadth of the concept. Right? If you're able to understand the very depth of what Rabbi Akiva is saying, then you can see how when he says things in all these other places, he's just following that principle. We saw so many times in the Rebbe Sichos how the Rebbe does that. So if you get to the Nakuda and the etzem and the oimuk of an idea, of a svara, you're able to see how it can be applied across seemingly disparate cases that have nothing to do with each other. But through that, you're able to combine all of them and see the unity across the different scenarios. The depth of a concept is something which is uncontainable. And it doesn't have just one limited application. It can spurt out across multiple ways of application. So it's really the dibur is what the dibur does. It gets you to the oimuk. And once you have the oimuk, then you can have the reichav, then you can have the oirech, and you can have all the many components. But when a person was just thinking about it in their head and they hadn't said a word, the idea remains very restricted and contained. But dibur, what it does is it catalyzes. It has something in it that catalyzes the concept as it comes in contact with dibur. Dibur is able to radically transform what was originally a very limited and contained idea into something much more expansive and something much more profound. So again, we have the word nimtza. So nimtza what? So we find that what? So if you add up all of your nimtzas that we've had till now, the dibur has nothing of its own. It receives everything from above, and even the form. Nevertheless, the dibur is able to be mamshech. And how have we proven this? What proof are we given this? Do we bring a pasuk?
No, from what we see.
Experience, right? Yeah. Empirical evidence. Everyone knows this. Anyone who's had to ever teach something knows this. It's ma'asim b'chol yom, and you can imagine how much more so is someone who's attuned to how they work. Especially if you think like a Rebbe takes ideas that, how is he going to explain the ideas he's going to teach over in the Maimah, right? He's got to teach people who are relatively, not just relatively, absolutely inferior intellects. So the Rebbe has to think about ways how they're going to explain it. And he's describing a process that when you speak it out, it allows a flowing of the idea in a much more expansive way and a profound way than was achievable through just thinking it through. So nimtza that through speech there is a new revelation of the idea than was prior to its articulation in speech. Which the intellect couldn't self-generate this level of profundity and expansiveness in an idea on its own. At the original state, it only has a restricted way about what it can achieve. It will always be limited. And through deep analytical thought of this idea, you still would not be able to get to the very core and oimek and depth of this idea, or this halacha which we gave as the example. It's only specifically through dibur that this can be achieved.
Isn't it a bit odd though? Because you would have thought that machshav would be, you could go on with it forever. You have dibur, you can only say it one thing, and it can only be at one time, and not. But even though withstanding all these things, dibur is the greater, so to speak, in a way. But it's even more interesting because the only way dibur is great is in the way that it causes a machshava. It's not that dibur by itself is great. Dibur has to come from machshava, and through speaking it, you bring about a machshava. True.
You bring about a profound
in your seichel
revelation of this concept from its source that wasn't available.
So if chachma seichel is better, then we don't need dibur. If dibur is better, why is the whole point?
Yeah, but seichel can't self-generate.
Why why does he need dibur to do that?
Okay, but we're going to get there. We're still in the middle of the idea. But the point is that seichel alone cannot self-generate the idea in this to this degree of profundity. It's only once it becomes articulated in speech that it's capable of expressing that.
Also, why dibur surely you would think would be
right. That was his whole argument. In the previous paragraph, he argued.
We see that works like this, but
we see
why?
that. Okay, we're going to get there. We're not there yet. He's building up his point. He's saying one would assume this would not be the case,
and it is.
But anuroim b'chush that it is the case. So what would you? So what do we then have to assume? That our perception of dibur is probably wrong. If we see dibur as just a conduit, it's not just a container. It's like it's a funnel of an idea, and it's just it's an inconsequential part of the process. That's why we were surprised it's having any of this impact. But now we realize it does have this impact if we really think about it. So maybe what we thought about dibur was wrong. Maybe it's not just a conduit. And maybe we have to rethink our notion of a kais. A kais, and what a makabel is, what a receptacle is something more profound than we were previously aware of. So we must say the hainu lefisha kol gilui eir seichel. We must say that whenever there is an expression of a person's intellectual consciousness, hemshekh mimakeirei shu okeach hamaskil, it emanates from where? From the nefesh is the way the nefesh has the capacity to be intellectual, which we call the keach hamaskil. At that stage, when the keach hamaskil produces a seichel golui, eira seichel, which is going to be nimshach in the keach hamaskil, we describe it. All that's going to be revealed, it's not going to be revealed the entirety of wisdom, or even that own person's whole capacity for intellectual awareness. All that's going to be in any given expression, intellectual expression, is going to be a restricted and limited amount of intellectual expression. It's not just an open door; everything just flows out, right? Uki yadua, like it is well known. The Masha F Shalovili de Gilu Miakech Hamaskil Bederich Eir Yashar Mitzad Atzmei Bli Dova Hamachriach Eisai Hurak Ha'orich Itzenis V'menu Levat. And this is what we know from many other places as well as explained in other places, that this expression Eir Yasha means a direct light. Yeah, direct in the sense that it is. It's usually in the sense of directly milmayla lamata. So in a process of expression, that when where it originates from, when it's self-generated, that thing will generate, and we call that an Eir Yasha. So here we're talking about intellect. So the Eir Yasha of intellect, if left to its own devices on its own, without any external things forcing it or prompting it to be anything other than what it is, all that's going to be produced is what we call the ha'orichitzins, is this sort of much more superficial expression. Just like when we were talking earlier about when the Rav is mashpia to the Talmud. So the Rav, already there being a Talmud is something which is being machriach the seichel. But say that the Rav is preparing something, an idea, he's not going to give over the the full gamut of his ideas and his intellectual abilities. Rather, it's going to be something that is just a ha'arich hitzonos. It's not the thing itself. It's a reflection of the thing that the person has. Yasha, a gilui, anything that's a gilui of something is not the thing itself. Kol etzem bilti miskala. Something which is an essential thing is not revealed. It's not in a state of revelation. The revelation is a revelation of that thing. And it being of that thing, it's a reflection of that thing. If it would be the very essence of the thing, it wouldn't be biskalas. Because an essential thing, what defines something as being essential is that it doesn't depend on anything else. It doesn't relate to anything else. It doesn't care for anything else because it's its own thing. Whereas a gilui is sort of the personality, the identity of a gilui is to convey something. The very sense that it's revealing something to something else. And therefore it's not the thing itself. The thing itself doesn't need to be revealed. Has no compulsion to be revealed. And so therefore, whenever there is a gilui in a manner of oyasha from something essential like the keach hamaskil, the nefesh, it's only going to be a ha'arich hitzonos. It's not going to be the nefesh itself. Ulazais. And therefore what happens is gam be'iyun, I skipped a line. Shezeu bali de gilui. All that's revealed is the ha'arich hitzonos. Aval pnimiyusli v'atzmiyusli eina bali de gilui mi atzmichuli. An essential thing without something forcing it to be the case, without in sort of the natural order of things, and kol etzem bilti miskala. The etzem is not going to be contained within this reflection of itself. It's just a reflection of itself. Ulazais, and therefore, gam be'iyun k'shema ayin b'hadav seichel, that when a person deeply analyzes an intellectual concept, lo yiskala yosem imasha efshel yiskalis. All that's going to be revealed is what's capable of being revealed. The person's only going to be able to grasp sort of an external, superficial, peripheral notion of the idea. And then he makes a very important qualification in the brackets. Unless there's a lot of questions, what he calls halamas v'esteirim, concealments. So the manner of learning is in a manner of machashakim heshivani, in a way of darkness, and this propels the intellect to think about it in a alternative way, and it sort of creates resistance to the idea. So you have a flow of the idea, yasha, but then it comes up with all of these roadblocks and these complexities that doesn't allow it to be expressed. And that creates a new dynamic. That is able to trigger an awareness of something much more essential and deeper in the idea. So the person is able to reach their koyach hamaskil in a way that wasn't readily apparent when the idea was first evolving in the self. And what we call that, and that's all, that is the very notion of the oir-chayza, this sort of rebounding light. And that once it experiences that friction and that opposition, that can trigger a deeper awareness. Like we said in other places. So that's a very important point. That through even Ian b'machshava, we said before, through Ian b'machshava you can't reach anything. But if the Ian b'machshava is in a manner of kushis v'tirutim, in a manner of a chayza, then there's potential that it could achieve what we would describe, this sort of much more profound understanding of the concept. But that's a bracket, we can leave it on the side at the moment. He mentioned something similar in the fourth Maimon. In the Maimon of Arava, this is going to come up again, the impact of this style of learning, which is in a way becomes somewhat comparable to Dibur. but that's because it's Ercheza. And Ercheza has many of the similar qualities that we're going to describe in a Makabel. But let's leave that on the side for the moment because we're not delving into it. But we'll come back to it in the fourth Maimah, and it's important to realize that this is sort of a parallel theme. Ercheza in learning is a parallel theme. So it's not through the normal evolution of an idea in the self, which is Yasha. There it's only a very it's just a mere reflection of the capacity of the Keach HaMaskil, and it's only through Dibur specifically that you can reveal the very depth of the Keach HaChochma, Keach HaChmasei, the depth of the person's intellectual abilities, the depth of this particular concept. So this achievement cannot be achieved on its own, and it's specifically through articulating in speech that you can achieve this. And that is because the letters of speech are forcing the person's ability for intellectual cognition, that it should be expressed and revealed to a far greater degree than it can do on its own. And therefore, when an intellectual idea is expressed in speech, it's then specifically that person is able to reach the depth of that idea, which he was unable to achieve prior when he was analyzing it just in thought.
Why? It says Lefi, but
what?
Why is that so?
Well, we're not there yet. That we're gonna get to on Amud Ches. He's just stating that to be the case.
So through speaking, you're machriach your Keach HaChachma to think more.
Yeah. Has a power to make it reveal more than it was able to do by itself.
Because it gives it Gdarim?
Why does it do it?
It's like,
or how does it do it?
Meaning, like, what does it do?
Okay, wait a second. At the moment we're just stating what it does.
What does it do?
It forces the Keach HaChochma, Keach HaMaskil of the person to divulge more than it's able to do in its own process. It's its own internal process of the Keach HaMaskil. It only, through Oyasha, only reveals and expresses a reflection, a ha'ara of the idea. But through speaking it, the letters of speech have the power to sort of demand of the Keach HaMaskil to reveal more. And that's what it does. Why it does it and how it does it is something we're going to get to later. We're just at the moment describing that. Okay?